Power does not whisper. It screams. It bleeds. It breaks. In the ancient world, justice wore a crown, and that crown often dripped with blood. To defy the king was to gamble with your flesh. To whisper rebellion was to beg for dismemberment. Because kings were not merely rulers. They were executioners, priests of pain, architects of fear. Their punishments were not swift. They were designed, crafted to humiliate, to prolong, to echo across the bones of the watching crowd. Because suffering in their courts was not tragedy. It was theater, boiling oil, metal beasts, blades that danced slowly through skin, rats, ropes, rusted hooks, all tools in the sacred ritual of royal vengeance. But here's the most chilling part. The kings didn't turn away. They watched, sometimes in silence, sometimes in delight. Tonight, we unseal the blackest chambers of history and examine 10 of the most brutal punishments ever used by ancient kings. Each one real. Each one soaked in the screams of the past. If you thought royalty was all silk and splendor, you've been looking at the crown, not the blade beneath it. Stay close. The horrors have just begun. They sat above the world, clothed in velvet, crowned with gold and feared like gods. Their thrones carved from marble and myth. But the deeper truth? Most kings ruled not through wisdom, but through terror. In ancient kingdoms, law was not debated. It was declared. A king's word could raise a man to nobility or crush him beneath a wheel. And when that word turned to punishment, there were no limits. Justice, in those times, was not about fairness. It was about order forged through fear. The courtroom was the courtyard. The gavel was the blade. These rulers believed pain was sacred. Not just a tool, but a language. A message carved into flesh for others to read. To question the crown was to gamble your body. To offer it to iron and flame. To become a warning carved in human agony. The punishments were not random. They were art, designed to last. To linger in the minds of the people long after the screaming had stopped. Sometimes they were swift, but more often slow, unfolding like a performance, a twisted morality play, where disobedience met its violent end. Kings surrounded themselves with philosophers, priests, soldiers, but none were closer than the executioner. And what's worse, the people watched. They gathered beneath palace balconies and gallows. They brought children. They cheered. Because fear, when fed often enough, becomes normal. It becomes tradition. It becomes law. Tonight, we peer through that veil of history, not to marvel at thrones or empires, but to bear witness to what was done in their name. By kings. By gods in human skin. Now let us begin. Close your eyes. Imagine a time when kings were gods on earth. When a single glance from the throne could decide life. Or deliver a death so terrible, it echoed for centuries. Tonight, we descend into forgotten chambers, walk along blood-soaked corridors, and uncover the methods of punishment designed not just to end a man's life, but to break his soul. These were no ordinary executions. These were spectacles, devised to terrify, perfected to linger. Let us begin. The Brazen Bull, ancient Greece. In the heart of Sicily, in a city called Acragas, a ruler named Phalaris sat on a throne of fear. He ruled with such cruelty that even his punishments were crafted as art. One day, an inventor named Perillos arrived with a gift. A statue glorious and gleaming. A bull made entirely of bronze. But this was no ordinary statue. It was hollow, and inside, a space just large enough for a man to be locked within. Phalaris smiled. Once a prisoner was placed inside, a fire would be lit beneath the bull. Slowly, the metal would heat. The man inside would roast alive. But there was more. Perillos had added pipes and valves within the bull's head. When the man screamed, his cries would echo through the pipes, emerging from the bull's mouth, as if the creature itself were roaring. A chorus of suffering, disguised as music. Phalaris was pleased. And then, he tested the invention. By locking Perillos inside, he wanted to hear his masterpiece perform. And it did. The bull sang. And its first notes were the screams of its own creator. Scaphism, ancient Persia. Far across the sands, in the great Persian Empire, there existed a punishment meant not for swift death, but for slow, unraveling torment. It was called scaphism. The condemned was stripped, laid between two narrow canoes or hollowed logs. his body trapped, arms and legs protruding. Then the feeding began. Milk. Honey. More milk. More honey. Until he could take no more. Until he vomited and defecated where he lay. Then, the same sticky mixture was smeared over his face, his limbs, his eyes, and finally, he was left afloat on a still, stagnant pond, exposed to the sun, to the flies, to every creeping thing that thrives on rot. Day after day, his body became a banquet. His flesh bloated. Insects burrowed deep into open sores. Worms feasted on what lived. But he did not die. Not quickly. This could last for weeks. Each hour, more unbearable than the last. It was not just a punishment. It was a transformation. From man to husk. From living to being consumed by the world he once walked upon. Flaying alive Assyria. The Assyrians were master builders, skilled warriors, and meticulous record keepers. But they were also artists of fear. Among their most feared punishments was flaying. To rebel against the king meant to be displayed, not just as a corpse, but as a message. A man would be bound to a pole or wall. Then slowly, with knives of bronze, his skin would be peeled away. Not in haste, but with precision. They believed the skin was not just part of the body. It was identity, honor, proof of existence. To strip it was to erase you. Once removed, the skin was stretched and hung. Outside city gates, on palace walls, near temples. As a warning. A silent threat, fluttering in the wind. It wasn't enough to kill a traitor. His flesh had to speak for him. Long after he was gone. The body was buried. The skin remained. A parchment of pain. Impalement, Vlad the Impaler, Wallachia. The wind in the Carpathian Mountains carries many stories, but none so chilling as that of Vlad III of Wallachia, known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. A ruler both revered and feared. His preferred method of execution wasn't merely brutal. It was theatrical. Impalement. The condemned would be stripped, their legs bound, and a long, sharpened wooden stake, thick, smooth, and deliberately unbarbed, would be carefully inserted through the lower body. But this was not rushed. Vlad's men were trained to avoid vital organs. The stake would rise slowly, through the body, emerging from the mouth, shoulder, or chest. Hours would pass, sometimes days, before death finally arrived. And while they suffered, Vlad would dine. It is said that he often ate his meals within view of the impaled. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies, lining the roads like grotesque signposts. To some, it was madness. To Vlad, it was order. A message carved into the flesh of fear. Disobey, and you become the message. The breaking wheel, medieval Europe. Under gray skies and stone gallows, the breaking wheel awaited its victims. It was a simple instrument. A large wooden wheel, laid flat or hoisted upright. But in the hands of kings and executioners, it became a canvas for cruelty. The condemned was bound across the wheel, limbs outstretched like the spokes of fate. Then came the hammer. One by one, bones were shattered. Arms, legs, ribs. Each blow measured, each snap deliberate. But they were not killed outright. Instead, their broken limbs were woven between the wooden spokes, twisted, contorted, until the body resembled a spiral of agony. Sometimes they were left there, raised on poles, still breathing, to face the crows in the sky, to die not of blood loss, but exposure, thirst, and time. In certain towns, the wheel was called the Catherine Wheel, named not after a punisher, but a saint who survived the torture. The wheel broke before she did. But for most, the wheel did not break. Only they did. Lingqi, China's death by 1,000 cuts. In the imperial courts of ancient China, where elegance met absolute power, there existed a punishment so calculated. It was poetry in torment. Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, reserved for traitors and those who defied the emperor's command. The execution was not swift. It was a ceremony, a slow dissection of dignity. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame, their shirt removed, and then the knife began its dance. A slice from the chest, a sliver from the thigh, muscle, skin, flesh, each cut deliberate, each wound shallow enough to prolong life, but deep enough to invite horror. The goal was not to kill, not yet, but to reduce a man into parts, to show how loyalty, once broken, could be paid for piece by piece. Witnesses were invited, sometimes family. The final stroke, delivered only after hundreds, was mercy, and when it was done, the body was not buried whole. It was ashes, scattered, so no spirit could rise again. Rat torture, Europe and Asia. Picture a dark dungeon. Stone walls dripping with moisture. The silence broken only by the scratching of claws. Rat torture was simple, but terrifying. A metal container, often a pot or a bucket, was placed on the bare stomach or chest of the prisoner. Inside, a live rat. Then the executioner would heat the metal. Slowly, patiently, until the rat began to panic. And when it could no longer bear the heat, it did what nature demanded. It dug, through flesh, through organs, desperately burrowing into the only escape it could find. The victim's body. Screams echoed off the stone walls, but they were not met with mercy. Sometimes the rat didn't survive. Other times, the prisoner didn't. Either way, the message was clear. Even the smallest creatures could become kings' weapons of fear. Poena Culiae, ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, where justice wore the face of civilization, there lived a punishment so bizarre. It reads almost like fiction. Poena Culiae, Latin for penalty of the sack. Reserved for one crime alone. Parricide, the murder of one's parent. The punishment? The guilty was sewn into a leather sack. Alongside animals. Not just any animals. A monkey, a rooster, a snake, and a dog. All alive. All frightened. Then the sack was sealed and thrown into a river. Inside chaos. Claws and fangs. Panic and suffocation. Why such a strange ritual? The Romans believed parricide disrupted the natural order. And so the killer was denied earth and sky. No burial. No return. Only a frantic, gasping descent into watery oblivion. Wrapped in fur and feathers and scales. Scaphism, ancient Persia. Of all ancient punishments, few matched the slow cruelty of the Persian scaphism. A boat, or rather 2 boats. One placed atop the other. The victim's body trapped between them. Arms, legs, and head protruding like limbs from a cocoon. Then came the milk. And the honey. They were fed in excess. Until sickness took hold. Then, honey was poured over every inch of exposed skin. A sweet invitation to insects. Over days, flies arrived. Beetles. Worms. Drawn not just to the honey, but to what lay beneath it. Sores, wounds, rot. The body became a living hive. A slow-motion feast. A death not of blade or fire, but of time and tiny jaws. It could take weeks to die. And all the while, the victim remained aware, trapped in sweetness and agony, flaying alive Assyria and beyond. And lastly, the punishment reserved for traitors, rebels, and enemies of the state. Flaying, to be flayed alive, was to have your skin removed. Not post-mortem, but in life. The Assyrians, masters of war and terror, perfected this art. The condemned was tied upright, naked, exposed. With a sharp knife, the executioner would begin at the legs, slowly peeling strips of skin from muscle. No cuts too deep, just enough to separate body from its armor. Sometimes entire backs were flayed clean. Sometimes the skin was nailed to city walls. A warning in the wind. To watch a man flayed was to watch him become less than human, a raw, twitching figure of pain. But to the kings who ordered it, it was simply governance. And now, as the final echoes of these ancient punishments fade, we're left not with screams, but silence, not with justice, but with the memory of kings who ruled with fear. Tonight, may their cruelty stay locked in the past, and may your dreams be gentler than the histories we've wandered through. Close your eyes. The past is behind you, and sleep awaits.